So far in Chapter 6, we've been looking in detail at deviance. And as a reminder, deviance is a violation of a social rule or a norm, and deviance or norm violation can be either positive or negative, as determined by members of society. For example, Mozart and Einstein were definitely norm violators, but their contributions to society were generally considered to be quite beneficial. On the other hand, Charles Manson and Ariel Castro were norm violators in ways that really harmed other people. And sociologists in general focus on the norm violators that harm other people. And we are going to continue along that same vein as we look at reactions to deviance in the second half of Chapter 6. Now, we're not going to look at all reactions to all deviance. We are just going to specifically look at reactions to crime, and more specifically reactions to street crime, and even more specifically reactions to getting caught and arrested for street crimes. In other words, who are the people that are in the penal system, and by that I mean those basically who are in jail and being punished by going through the court system by first getting arrested. So this is where we get our data from the penal system, from jails and prisons. And so since we have that data, let's just take a look at some characteristics of prisoners. First, let's look at some racial considerations. 39% of 39% of inmates in United States prisons are African American, even though they only comprise 13% of the overall population. So we see a significant overrepresentation of Black Americans in the American prisons. 43% of inmates are white, and they comprise 66% of the overall population. So there's a significant racial component to inmate populations. Also, there's a significant education component. If we look at the educational achievement of those who are incarcerated, 40%, which is significant, have less than a high school education. And 49% graduated from high school but have no college. So inmates are likely to have a relatively low level of education. Another significant factor is that 77% are not married. This includes mostly inmates who have never been married, as well as a smaller percentage of those who are divorced, and even smaller that are widowed. And marriage can be considered a social anchor, and we see that most of the inmates do not have that social anchor. Another feature of inmates is 93% are male, even though males only make up 49% of the population. So let's take a larger view of the prison system in the United States, which is most of the inmates are convicted of street crimes. If we look at the United States, which has less than 5% of the world's population, our population in the United States currently is about 318 million. And yet, we incarcerate more than 20% of the world's prisoners. The United States has the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. And here are just some statistics to give you a sense of where the United States falls. These statistics I got from the International Center for Prison Studies. And there are other statistics, but none of them vary significantly from these values here. So we look at how many incarcerations there are per 100,000 members of the population. The United States has 716, which is more than triple the amount of Canada, which has 188, England at 144, Norway at 10% the rate of United States at 72, and Australia at 130. So there's just a significant difference between this high rate of United States and other industrialized nations, both in North America, in Europe, and Australia as well. So how does sociology explain this high incarceration rate? Well, since the 1970s, the incarceration rate in the United States has increased tremendously, with all states showing an increase, sometimes as high as 600% in rate of incarcerations. And so here is an explanation of why that is. After the civil rights laws were passed in the 1960s, for the first time, the federal government became more involved in state justice systems, and we'll take a look at why this was in just a minute. And secondarily, the resulting unrest from the civil rights laws caused anxiety and among much of the population, and political tough-on-crime rhetoric resonated with the population and was often used as a powerful campaign strategy. So these are two separate issues, and this is just kind of scratching the tip of the iceberg. But let's look at why the federal government had to become involved more in the state justice systems. In the South, after the Civil War, when slaves became free men and free women and free children, these slaves were completely impoverished. They had no land, they had no money, they had no resources, and they represented a threat to the status quo, especially the white landowner. The South was suffering economically. It had lost a lot of buildings and infrastructure due to the Civil War, and it was trying to get its economy back on track. So what the South did is they passed, and by the South I mean the southern states that were opposed to the Union forces in the Civil War. And they passed these series of laws known as Black Codes, also known as Jim Crow laws. And what African Americans had to do if they didn't own land and they weren't able to provide for themselves, they had to hire themselves out by the 10th day of January of each year. If they didn't hire themselves out, they were arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to hard labor. And the conditions and mortality rates for these prisoners were extremely, extremely high. During the period after the Civil War, prison populations increased greatly, and they were about 95% black prisoners. These black prisoners were sent to work to agricultural and industrial companies. They were leased out. Sometimes the companies paid the government money and sometimes they didn't. In the case of North Carolina, the government did not receive any money, but they leased these prisoners out, and they provided free hard labor for agricultural and industrial companies throughout the South. And here's a picture of a chain gang. This was on a postcard. Around 1915 was when this postcard was printed. And in North Carolina, between 1873 and 1893, almost 2,000 miles of tracks were laid by African American prisoners. And as I said earlier, the conditions were absolutely brutal. They were chained together. They were not allowed to urinate or defecate apart from one another. Often they had to relieve themselves near an area where they were getting water. They had to urinate in water that they were also drinking because they were drinking from puddles. If their clothes got wet, they had to sleep in wet clothes. The South, right after the Civil War, did not have very many prisons because they were destroyed. So these prisoners were chained together and they were transported in these cages. These cages could also be put on railroad tracks and they were transported that way. The treatment of these chain gang members was far more brutal than that on the plantation because these prisoners were no longer considered property. And so if they died, it was of no loss. All the government had to do was go out and find some more prisoners to do the work. Here's a whip that was used on chain gang members. So many times, depending on the conditions, prisoners didn't even last 3 years on the chain gang because the conditions were so inhumane. So when the civil rights laws were passed, civil rights lawyers went to the federal government to redress some of the racist issues that were occurring in southern prisons. And about 36 of the southern prisons were found to violate federal law. And that opened the doors for the federal government to become more involved in the criminal justice system. More money came from the federal government geared towards crime prevention. And then in 1980s, the tough on crime policies, this rhetoric that I was talking about, the war on drugs that was initiated by Ronald Reagan came into play. So this tough on crime policies were very popular campaign strategies, and politicians enacted these very tough laws on crime. In 1991, the Supreme Court upheld life imprisonment for first-time drug offenders. So basically what I'm saying here is even though they were very harsh sentences, these punishments were upheld. And then in 1994, Clinton passed the 3 strikes and you're out. And we'll look at an example of that. But before I go any further, I want to kind of tie the post-war Southern prison system to these tough policies that were enacted in the 1980s to this harsh punishment theory. Real or imagined threats to community order will lead to harsher punishments to those singled out as a threat, and it will lead to greater solidarity of those in power. So we definitely see this with the chain gangs after the Civil War, and we definitely see this with the 3 strikes and you're out. And if we remember the high percentage of the black population in the prisons, we definitely see what could be construed as a racist attitude in terms of arresting and convicting perpetrators of street crime. So getting back to these tough policies that were legislated in the 1980s, which gave very little leeway for judges, very little wiggle room for judges unless the judges wanted to break the law. There are very harsh sentences. For example, in 2003, the Supreme Court upheld 25 years to life sentence for a man who was convicted of stealing 3 golf clubs worth $400 each. And since this was his 3rd offense, he was essentially out. And if we look at the cost, so these golf clubs amounted to about $1,200 total cost. We look at the cost estimate for keeping an inmate in prison for 1 year, anywhere from $16,000 to $23,000 per year per inmate. So it's a tremendous cost to taxpayers to incarcerate these prisoners for the long lengths of time that are required by these tough on crime laws. Now let's look at the death penalty. The death penalty was brought back into law in the late 70s, and there is also a racial bias with regard to the death penalty. If we look at the breakdown of the inmates that are on death row by racial groups, we see that, again, blacks are very overrepresented at 41%, and again, only 13% of the overall population. Other minority groups, Latino, Asian, and Native American, have more similar percentage characteristics, and the white, 44%, is significantly lower than the population in the United States. Another racial consideration of the death penalty is one is more likely to be on death row if the victim is white. And this is a little fuzzy, so let me just go over this. Here we have the defendants, white, black, Latino, Asian, and Native American, and their victims, white, black, Latino, Asian, and Native American. And if we look at the percentages here, 78% of the victims of those convicts on death row were white. Much lower numbers were black, 12%, then Latino, about 6%, and Asian and Native American, less than 2%. So again, a racial bias is showing up throughout the criminal justice system, and that's very concerning. If we look at international standards for death penalty, South Korea and Japan are the only other industrialized nations that have the death penalty, and South Korea hasn't executed anyone in, about 30 years. And recently, if we look at the international community, in 2002, the Council of Europe's Committee of Ministers abolished the death penalty in all circumstances. And in 2007, the United Nations General Assembly calls on all states to consider abolishing the death penalty. And if we take a look at the cost and effectiveness of the death penalty, It varies by state a little bit, but estimates for North Carolina are $2.16 million per execution. So the cost is extremely high, more per execution. That's not per execution, it's more dollars than a prisoner who is not undergoing a capital, who is not going under execution would cost. And also, if it's a capital case, it also costs much more money, even if it doesn't end in execution. Let's look at its effectiveness, and we can, if you would, you can look at page 188 and page 180 of your textbook. You'll see that Texas has the highest number of executions of all the states, and yet it still has a higher than average violent crime rate. And if we look at Maine, in terms of violent crimes, it's the safest state, and it doesn't even have the death penalty. So the effectiveness, based on the data, is definitely put into question. And another thing to consider is since 1976, at least 118 people on death row have been exonerated, which means they have been found not guilty. So another consideration is if someone is executed and they are found innocent afterwards, there's no way to redress that situation. Another factor of the new legislation that occurred in the 1980s was the definition of hate crimes. And in these crimes, the motivation is considered. If the motivation is a particular bias against religion or race or sexual orientation, then these crimes can be tried as hate crimes and receive a much harsher penalty. And if you look on table 5 on page 190 of the text, we can see that racially African Americans are most susceptible. Religiously, Jews are, and with sexual orientation, homosexuals are most likely to be victims of hate crimes. Now, a lot of the information that we've gone over here has been based on statistics. And it's important to base arguments and determine relationships and look at the data that's available from statistics, definitely. But it's also very important to consider the limits of statistics and where possible biases might lie. For example, if we look at crime statistics, we are looking at the population in prisons. Well, to get there, people have to be arrested. And if someone is arrested, that is up to police discretion. So there is definitely bias within the discretion of a police officer, as there would be for anyone, and that needs to be taken into consideration. Anytime we look at statistics, we always want to ask ourselves, where did this information come from? What are the possible biases? So although we're doing the best we can with the information we have, we always want to challenge assumptions and look for possible explanations or possible holes that might be present in our logic or in our theory or of our understanding. And lastly, at the end of chapter 6, we look at mental illness as a deviance. And there's a growing body of literature that suggests that mental illness is very dependent on social issues. For example, children who are bullied when they're younger have a higher propensity for mental illness, and children who grow up in the city are more likely to have mental illness later in life than are children who grew up in the country. So there are a lot of indicators showing that social factors might have a significant impact on mental illness. It may not just be the psychiatric doctor who has to deal with or can lend answers or insight into mental illness. It could also be the sociologist who has some important insights. So the example in your textbook talks about the relationship between homelessness and mental illness. Is one homeless because they're mentally ill, or does one become mentally ill after one becomes homeless? And either one could possibly be a viable explanation for the other. So this is what's known as a reciprocity relationship, where one could potentially cause the other. And there's definitely a need for more research, but the more we understand the factors that contribute to these mental illnesses, regardless of where they come from, whether they are chemical imbalances or chemical imbalances caused by social experiences, the better we'll be able to address these concerns and potentially reduce the suffering caused by mental illness and other social issues and problems.